show their stripes. The skin, and then there's got this interesting, I mean, these kinds of lines are all the way through the Iliad, right? Where you've got this interesting kind of remarkable exchange happening in the middle of a battle, right? Which, of course, on the one hand is absolutely silly, and yet it gives us a kind of understanding of maybe some ideas that are philosophic in nature. Look what he says about cowards versus the brave. The skin of the coward changes color all the time. He can't get a grip on himself. He can't sit still. He squats and rocks, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his heart racing, pounding inside the fellow's ribs, his teeth chattering. He dreads some grisly death. But the skin of the brave soldier never blenches. He's all control. Readers of this passage will go to Plato's dialogue Apology and say about Socrates, this is why Socrates must be called the new Hercules, the new Achilles. Because in the moment when Socrates knows that he's about to die, all control, as he says. Tense, but no great fear. The moment he joins his comrades packed in ambush, he prays to wade in carnage, cut and thrust at once. Who could deny your nerve there, your fighting hands? Why, even if you were badly wounded in battle, winged by a shaft or gored by a blade close up, the weapon would never hit you behind in neck or back. All of the injuries are on the front. In other words, you're running at the bullets, not away from them. It would pierce your chest or guts as you press forward, lusting for all the champion's lovely give and take. On with it. This will remind us of that exchange that happens at the very end of Shakespeare's Macbeth, when the older Seawood will ask about his young son who fought against Macbeth and died. Were his wounds on the front or on the back? In other words, all he's interested in is asking, was he brave, courageous, even in his death, right? On with it, he says. No more standing round like bragging boys. Someone will dress us down, and roughly two. Off you go to my shelter. Choose a sturdy spear. And so, off he goes. Now, we get some information about just how terrible this fighting is at lines 390 and following. Okay, so the battle broke. Storming chaos, troops in flames, slashing each other with bronze, carnage mounting, manslaughtering combat bristling with rangy spears, the honed lances brandished in hand and ripping flesh, and the eyes dazzled now, blind with the glare of bronze, glittering helmets flashing, breastplates freshly burnished, shields fiery in sunlight, fighters plowing on in mass. Only a veteran, steel at heart, could watch that struggle and still thrill with joy and never feel the terror. Now, when we pick up Tolstoy's War and Peace, and we read those really influential battle scenes, you get a sense that Tolstoy is responding to lines like this. That in the Iliad, you have the glorification of hand-to-hand combat. That by the time Tolstoy's writing War and Peace and summarizing those tragic battles between the Russians and the French, Napoleonic France, he's going to respond in some ways to this idea that it's a glorious thing to die and all of that kind of thing. But here we've got a powerful now kind of representation of the idealizing of battle. At line 400, the two powerful sons of Kronos, Zeus and Poseidon, their deathless spirits warring against each other, were building mortal pains for seasoned heroes. Note the irony. Poseidon and Zeus are actually fighting against each other. Poseidon, of course, in secret, as we'll read in a second. But of course, these are immortal gods, and therefore they can't die, and therefore for them, they're not really fighting, are they? I mean, it's the men that are fighting, aren't they, right? Zeus, willing a Trojan victory, Hector's victory, lifting the famous runner Achilles' glory higher. Again, Achilles is mentioned several times in this book, obviously just referenced, right? But he had no lust to destroy the whole Argive force before the walls of Troy. All the father wanted was glory for Thetis and Thetis' strong-willed son. But Poseidon, surging in secret out of the gray surf, went driving into the Argive ranks and lashed them on, agonizing for the fighters, beaten down by Trojans, and his churning outrage rose against great Zeus. Both were gods of the same line, a single father, but Zeus was the elder born, and Zeus knew more. And so Poseidon shrank from defending allies out in the open, all in secret. Always armed like a man, the god kept urging armies on. This, by the way, is an understanding of the Greek gods that is surprising to many students who read this. In other words, there is a whole lot that Zeus does not know. He is not omnipotent, right? He's not all-knowing. So, I mean, if he had all power, Zeus, he would be able to recognize that Poseidon, his brother, is out there causing havoc in the Trojan ranks. Both gods knotted the rope of strife. We've seen this symbol, this word picture before. And leveling war. Now we're going to get that. We're going to come back to that notion, so put it in your notes already. Leveling war. Strangling both sides at once by stretching the mighty cable, never broken, never slipped, that snapped the knees of thousands. In a war culture, then, this is a poem that says, men will fight and men will die, and it is the gods who will it to be so. And therefore, don't complain or question, just simply combat, right? We then will have the great Aristeia of Mentis. He will kill Orthonius, who was going to marry, actually, we're told the Trojan was going to marry Cassandra. And then once he kills him, he will taunt him like, so I guess, you can marry in death and that kind of thing. And then Asias, also Mentis will kill. And you'll maybe remember that Asias was the one who defied Hector in Book 11 and decided he was going to drive his chariot right when Hector said we're going to head and attack on foot, and he drove right at the walls of the ramparts. And then we meet the Trojan Diphibius, who is going to avenge Asias' death, and he will make a taunt himself as he does this. We're told, but Diphibius' strong swift hurl was not for nothing. No, he caught Hippander, Hippias' son, the captain, struck him under the midriff, slit his liver. In that instance, the man's knees went limp. We get all kinds of instruction in the Iliad about what a blade or a point can do to a man's body from all body parts, right? Diphibius shouted, vaunting in wild glory. And we got a lot of shouting and screaming in Book 13, by the way. Asias dies, but not without revenge. Down to the god of death he goes, I tell you, down to the mighty gates, but thrilled at heart. Look at the escort I have sent him for the journey. In other words, you got to avenge the death of a friend. It reminds us of those Beowulf lines from Beowulf 2. We'll get there later, when Beowulf will say to old King Hrothgar, all men must die. Let him who may win glory ere death. Right, better to avenge a friend than much to mourn, he says in that famous speech. Okay. Then from there we will move to Mentis taunting Diphibius, and Diphibius then will call Aeneas for help, and we will then have this call for help when he calls for Aeneas at line 55 or so. He says, over here, my friends, I'm all alone. Defend me. I fear Aeneas, terribly coming on at top speed, bearing down on me now and filled with power, enormous power to take men down in battle. He's just in the first flush of youth. This is interesting because these will be lines that Virgil will play with, obviously, as he begins to develop his idea of the Aeneid, where Aeneas will become the great hero who ultimately will found the Roman people who ultimately will defeat the Greeks. And therefore, for Virgil, the Greeks didn't actually win the Trojan War with their little horse and all of that, but rather the Trojans won because Aeneas is so valiant. So he's just in the first flush of youth, line 560. What's more, the greatest power of all. If we were the same age, I tell you, just as the same fury fills us both, at a single stroke, he'd bear off glory now, and I'd bear it off myself. So the Cretan, we're told, yelled, and again more yelling, and his comrades came in pack with one will. And so you got Aeneas with all of his buddies as well across the line, and he will call for help. Paris, we're told, will show up as well. And then you've got Menelaus's Aristeia that will happen next. And this is a fascinating one, and it's worth our studying. It's, again, interesting. The few times in the Iliad when Menelaus and Paris show up, of course, they showed up together to fight against each other, obviously, but now we're working at line 693 or so and following. And now, Pisander rushed, Menelaus famed in arms, but a grim fate was rushing him to the stroke of death to be crushed in this hell of war by you, Menelaus. It's fascinating how every once in a while the poet will step into the second person usage as if he's speaking directly to Menelaus. Almost like, hey, Menelaus, do you remember that time when Pisander attacked you in that one battle? Remember that outside the walls of Troy? Just as the two men closed, heading into each other, Atrides, Menelaus, missed his spear shift, hooking off to the side. This, by the way, is one of the standard motifs of the Aristeia. You throw a spear, it misses, it sticks into the ground or whatever, and then you've got the follow-up. Pisander stabbed his blade, but the bronze could not bore through. The huge hide blocked it. The shaft snapped at the socket. Still the Trojan exulted, wild with hopes of triumph, as Menelaus, drawing his sword with silver studs, leapt at Pisander, who clutched beneath his shield his good bronze axe, with its cleaving blade set on a long, smooth olive haft. A clash. Both fighters at one stroke chopped at each other. Pisander hacked the horn of the horsehair-crested helmet right at its ridge, lunging as Menelaus hacked Pisander between the eyes, the bridge of the nose, and bone-cracked, blood-sprayed, and both eyes dropped at his feet to mix in the dust. He curled and crashed. Digging a heel in his chest, Menelaus stripped his gear and vaunted out in glory. Now, this is an interesting speech, and this is the reason we're reading this. I mean, again, for the squeamish stomach, I apologize that we have to come to these lines this way. But it's the speech that follows that I'm most interested in. So here we go. Now, let's listen to our speech at 7, 13, 14, 15. So, home you'll run from our racing ships, by God, all as corpses. See, you death-defying Trojans. Never sated with shattering war cries are you. Nor do you lack the other brands of outrage, all that shame you heaped on me, you rabid dogs. Remember, this is Menelaus, whose wife Helen was taken. No fear in your hearts for the quaking rage of Zeus, the thundering god of host and welcome stranger. This Xenia idea that host-guest relationship. In other words, Menelaus is reminding the Trojans, all of this carnage happened because I invited your Prince Paris into my house and he took away my teammate, my wife, my Helen, right? The thundering god of host and welcome stranger. One day he'll raise your lofty city for you. This again is, of course, the predictions that don't happen in the Iliad, but we know they are going to happen, that ultimately the city of Troy will fall. You, Trojans, who stole away my wedded wife and hordes of riches too, for no reason, none. By the way, point out two things. He blames the Trojans. You Trojans stole my wife. And of course, it was actually Paris. And notice it was stole away my wedded wife and hordes of riches too. In other words, when Paris leaves with Helen, apparently he didn't leave with just Menelaus' wife, but he took a whole lot of Menelaus' treasure as well, right? Which may have been one of the reasons why the Trojans were not so quick to even think about giving Helen back. If a guy shows up with Paris, if a guy shows up and he's got billions of dollars worth of stuff, then maybe the Trojans are like, okay, well, we'll maybe hold on to this for a while, right? He says, for no reason, none, my queen of the realm, who hosted you with kindness. In other words, the only one that he's really talking about is Paris, who hosted with kindness. And now you rampage on among our deep sea ships, wild to torch our hulls and kill our heroes. Well, you'll be stopped somewhere, mad as you are for combat. Zeus, Father Zeus, they say, you excel all others. And then it's almost as if now he makes a prayer to Zeus. All men and gods, in wisdom, clear and calm. But all this brutal carnage comes from you. Look how you favor them, these reckless Trojans, their fury always in uproar. We're going to have screaming at the end of this book to validate this. No one can ever slack their thirst for blood, for the great leveler war. Again, we're back to that notion, right? One can achieve his fill of all good things, even of sleep, even of making love, rapturous song and the beat and sway of dancing. A man will yearn for his fill of all these joys before his fill of war, but not these Trojans. No one can glut their lust for battle. Well, of course, we should point out that while the Trojans, through Paris, did steal Helen and all those treasures, now the Trojans are fighting for their very lives, right, to defend their city, their wives, their children, and the like, right? We then will have an exchange where Paris will kill Eushunor, and it's interesting comment about Eushunor, this Greek, and we get a little bit of an insight as to who some of these troops are that are fighting at the walls of Troy against the Trojans. I'm at line 765 or so. Well, Eushunor knew that boarding the ships of Troy, back in the past, meant certain death. His father told him so. Time and again, the strong old prophet said he'd die in his own halls of a fatal plague, or go with the ships and die at Trojan hands. So off Shinar sailed, both to save his wealth from the heavy fine the Argives made deserters pay, and himself from wasting illness. No slow plague for him. Now that's fascinating, because a little insight here. Apparently what happens is, after Helen leaves with Paris, Menelaus goes to brother Agamemnon. Agamemnon goes around to all the Greek kingdoms and says, either you come and you fight, or you'll be paying a heavy fine for not coming and fighting. That is to say, the deserter line here, right? Suddenly, Paris struck him under the jaw and ear, and life flew from his limbs, and the hateful darkness had him in its grip. The rest fought on like a mass of whirling fire, but Hector, dear to Zeus, had no idea. Hector heard nothing of how his men, left of the ships, were torn and mauled in the Argives' rough response. The glory might even have gone to them at any moment, so intent was the god who grips and shakes the earth, Poseidon, as he surged his Argives on, and the gods surged too, aiding his own immortal force in their defense. But Hector kept on driving too. So in other words, we've got this powerful exchange, right? The fighting happening. Then we've got this interesting exchange between Polydamas to Hector. Now Polydamas is going to challenge in some ways Hector right in the middle of the war, and he's going to say, we need a better plan. And the way he says this is also quite fascinating at line 835 or so. He says, deadly going then and there, the Trojans might have been rolled back far away from the ships and tents to wind-torn Troy if Polydamas had not rushed to headstrong Hector. And now begins to speak to him. Impossible, man. Won't you listen to reason? Just because some god exalts you in battle, you think you can beat the rest at tactics too. How can you hope to garner all the gifts at once? Be both a great fighter and also intelligent. One man is a splendid fighter. A god has made him so. One's a dancer, another's skilled at lyre and song, and deep in the next man's chest, far-seeing Zeus plants the gift of judgment. Good, clear sense. I mean, it's amazing. In the middle of the war, Polydamas is going to make this observation that we each have our own special kinds of gifts. Some are great fighters. We think of Achilles, we think of Hector. He says some are great dancers, whoever that might be. Some are great at lyre and song. We think of Achilles in Book 9, strumming his guitar and singing songs of fallen heroes as Odysseus and his pals show up. And then he says, some are able to have judgment, the gift of judgment. Good, clear sense. Obviously, Polydamas is speaking of himself, right? And many reap the benefits of that treasure. Troops of many saves, as he himself knows best. So now I will tell you what seems best to me. Look, the battle burns like a swirling crown around your head. I would put that in our notes, because a little bit later in Book 18, at the very end of this longest day, we will have the great Achilles described as a crown of fire around his head, right? But our valiant Trojans, once they scale the wall, some fall back from the front, idling in armor, others soldier on, squads against mass formations, scattering helter-skelter around the holes. The phrase helter-skelter, you probably know the history of, I'm sure. Draw back now. Call the best of our captains here, this safe ground. Then we can all fall in and plan our tactics well. Whether we fling ourselves against the ships, if Zeus would care to hand us victory now, or beat retreat from the beach and cut our losses. I fear they'll pay us back for yesterday's triumph. He waits by the ships, a man never sated with battle. Again, Achilles is referenced without it being direct. I doubt he'll keep from the fighting any longer, not with all his war lust. The ironies begin to abound. In other words, Polydamas says, we're getting closer and closer to the tents of Achilles and the boats of Achilles. We've got to be careful, because once we get there, we'll draw him in, and drawing him in could be bad news for all of us. Speaking these words to Hector is, of course, ironic, because, of course, Hector and Achilles will have their final hour together, won't they, right? We then will have Hector going in search of his brother. And this is always fascinating. I mean, you remember the last time this happened, Hector found his brother sitting in his bedroom with Helen polishing his armor. Here, we're going to meet the royal Paris. And every time royal gets used as an adjective, you can't help but kind of roll your eyes a bit. 885 or so. Royal Paris, fair-haired Helen's consort, was rousing comrades driving them back to battle. Once he gained his side, Hector raked his brother with insults, stinging taunts. Quote, Paris, appalling Paris, our prince of beauty, mad for women, you lured them all to ruin. This is the patent phrase that Hector will always use about Paris, right? Where's Deiphobus, Helenus, rugged warlord, Adamas, Aeneas' son, and Aias son of Hercules? Where's Orthunius? Tell me. Now all towering Troy is ruined, top to bottom. Now one thing's certain, your own headlong death. And Paris, magnificent as a god, replied, Hector, bent on faulting a man without a fault. At other times I might have shrunk from the fighting, true, but not today. Mother bore me, even me, not to be a coward, through and through. Think, since you fired our comrade's fury against the ships from that hour, we've held our ground right here, taking the Argives on, and non-stop, no rest. Our comrades are dead, Hector, those you inquire about with such concern. Only Deiphobus and the rugged warlord Helenus have made it back alive, wounded with sturdy spears, both in the hand too. But Zeus beat off their deaths. Now, lead the way, wherever your fighting spirit bids you. All of us right behind you, hearts intent on battle. Nor do I think you'll find us short on courage long as our strength will last. Past his strength no man can go, though he's set on mortal combat. So in other words, in the middle of the war, we've got this kind of insulting, taunting happening to Paris, and Paris says, dude, I'm right here, but all of our Trojans are dying. You have to lead us, and we will follow. We're told then that Hector will begin the process then to return and fight. At line 392, Hector plows forward. Hector plowed forward, testing enemy lines at all points to see if they'd crack before him, charging under his shield, but he could not overpower the Argives' stiff resolve. And Ajax, hurtling forward with big strides,